Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the second of our three-part webinar series. I'm Erin Robison, and I'm the director of Hammer Prep. Presenting with me tonight, as always, is Andrea Scalero, our head of admissions. We started doing these webinars 6 years ago or so as a way to get reliable and accurate information into the hands of our clients and our friends. The admissions landscape changes constantly, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. Tonight's webinar will be fairly data heavy, and so as always, please feel free to reach out to us with any questions if you need clarification or if you need one of us to help you map a path forward. Andrea is pretty much going to be running the show tonight. So while families continue to join us, I want to remind you of a few things. We are going to go through a lot of data this evening, and we will dive into the trends from the most recent data dumps from schools. The information we're presenting tonight is current as of right now. ChatGPT, Google, your best friend, the neighbor down the street are generally not reliable sources of information regarding admissions. We strongly encourage you to go to someone like us who does this all day long, or to go directly to the universities for information, as policies and requirements will shift a lot over the next 3 to 4 months. When in doubt, call the admissions office directly. They love to talk to parents, and they will have the most current information. Also, this is an incredibly stressful time of year for our students, and undoubtedly, most of your kids are likely fairly cranky right now. Before broaching the subject of anything that we're going to discuss tonight, I strongly encourage parents to keep their kids focused on school and their AP exams. We are so close to that finish line of the school year, and it's imperative that your students finish as strong as possible. We can dive into all of this with them once they're sleeping well and speaking back in complete sentences. You will ultimately have questions this evening, so as they pop into your head, feel free to put them into the Q&A tab down below. Zoom likes to change things around frequently, so if you can't see the tab that says Q&A at the bottom of your screen, click on the three little dots that say more, and it should show up. We'll present for about the next 40 minutes or so, and then we'll get into as many questions as we possibly can. Last webinar, we talked about a lot of the small steps that you can take early in high school to set your student up for success. As a reminder, the four biggest factors in admissions decisions are, in order, number one, the courses that your student takes and the letter grades that they get in those courses. Number two, their measurable data, like the SAT, the ACT, and the AP. Number three is their extracurricular activities and how they choose to spend their time after school. And number four is what they say in their essays. The classes that your children choose show admissions officers what's interesting to them and what path they may want to take for their futures. Despite what your kids may think, admissions officers will see every single letter grade that students get over their freshman, sophomore, and junior years. And senior year grades still matter, as they eventually see those grades as well. Choose classes wisely and let your kids lean into the courses that interest them. Let them choose rigor in areas where they excel and where they're excited. It's okay to back off in areas of challenge as long as students are doing well in those classes. Very, very, very few students should be taking all weighted classes. And no matter what your students tell you, a B in a weighted class is not the same as an A in an unweighted class. Universities often recalculate the school-issued GPA to what is important to them. They will see every class. They will see every letter grade. Moving on to the second biggest factor, standardized test scores. The SAT and ACT scores are incredibly important because schools are finding the test optional landscape, the grades are not always an indicator of mastery. The SAT and ACT exams legitimize the grades, and they give admissions officers a way to compare all the applicants across the pool. Test optional does not mean that it's actually optional. Data from the past 5 years shows that when a student can get a competitive score, their chances of admission increase dramatically. Current juniors still have time to get scores in time for their admission cycle, but we need to begin prep pretty soon. In the beginning of June, we want to get them started, and that's so that we have them prepared in time for early action, early decision applications if they choose to do that, and so that they have multiple opportunities to take these exams before regular decision applications are due. Current sophomores ideally should prep over this next summer before their junior year. We do this because it allows us to take a piece off of their plates during their junior year when things get really, really crazy. And ideally, we have them done then before they roll into the spring when they start focusing on their AP exams. Speaking of AP exams, they're coming up in less than 2 weeks, as I'm sure all of you are aware. And like the SAT and ACT scores, the AP scores legitimize students' letter grades and they provide context to admissions officers. We can self-report those scores on the applications, although there are a couple of schools that do require students submit all of their scores. How your child chooses to spend their time outside of school gives the admissions committee insight into your student's personality and what they really care about. Their extracurricular activities should tell a story, and longevity matters in those activities. Jobs are also a really great way to show you that your student is reliable, responsible, and that they can be trusted. And so without further ado, now that we've recapped webinar one, I'm going to introduce Andrea Scalero, who is going to pick on the UC system for a little bit and talk about admission stats and guide us through how to begin building a list. So over to you, Andrea.
Awesome. Thanks, Erin. And thank you all so much for being here. Like Erin mentioned, our goal with all of these webinars is just to put out as much reliable, useful information as we can for our families and community. It is an overwhelming amount of stress and pressure on students and families with the landscape constantly changing. And so we hope that this information can help guide your family and your student to some schools that might be great fits for them, or at least so they understand what's coming next. Like Erin mentioned, I am going to pick on the UCs, honestly, because they just make it so easy. One of the reasons why they make it so easy is they actually disseminate a ton of information. They put together lots of different statistics and lots of different information. They're very transparent with their data, which I love. Now, don't get me wrong, if this is one of your first times trying to dig into the UC data, you might not think it's super transparent because of the way it's presented. It can be very difficult to weed through it all. But I've been doing this for years and I love getting to dig into this data. Another reason why it's super easy to pick on the UCs, if you joined us for webinar one and you remember, we looked at the top 10 most applied to universities in the United States, and 6 of those are UC campuses. And pretty consistently year after year, those 6 remain in that top 10 most applied to colleges. So that's another reason why it's pretty easy to dig into some of their data, because so many students really are applying to them. They're incredibly popular. So we're going to start by picking on the most applied to university in the world. I think this is the 7th year in a row now that they've held that title. So we're going to talk about UCLA. And one of the things we're going to talk about is we're going to look at 3 different high schools, and we're going to look at some different statistics from those 3 different high schools. So if we look at a local public school here in San Diego, we'll take Torrey Pines, for example. Last year, so for the students who are freshmen at UCLA, coming from Torrey Pines, the acceptance rate was 8.4%, which is almost perfectly on par with the overall acceptance rate at UCLA, which hovers pretty close to 9%. They took 21 students to UCLA from Torrey Pines, but they had 250 applicants. So a really large portion of that graduating class from Torrey did apply to UCLA. The average UC GPA for students who were admitted from that high school was a 4.26. Please remember, we talked about this very briefly in webinar one, but the UCs recalculate GPA with a very specific formula. So it's really important that you don't use your student's transcript when you are trying to figure out what your student's UC GPA is. It is not a number that is reflected on any transcript. It's an actual number that you will have to calculate yourself based on the formula that they use. So it's important that you keep that in mind when you're trying to look at some of this to see how competitive or where your student might fall within some of these averages. Now, if we look at a local private school such as Cathedral, we had a slightly higher acceptance rate, closer to 12% into UCLA from last year's class. Even though UCLA took fewer students, they only accepted 16 students, they had far fewer applicants, only 137, which is still a lot of applicants from one high school, but significantly lower than that 250 we saw from the public school. However, the average GPA for UCLA that was admitted from Cathedral was a 4.29, which is almost as high as a student can get on that UC calculator. So all of these GPAs that we look at are really, really high for a UC GPA. It essentially means students were taking rigorous classes and they were getting straight A's. Now, if we venture outside of California, we'll go to Arizona, we'll look at Basis Scottsdale. Their acceptance rate massively increased from there, 24.2%. That's close to 3 times the national average for UCLA's acceptance rate, even though UCLA only accepted 8 students from that high school, so the smallest amount out of any of these 3 high schools, but they only had 33 applicants, so a much smaller portion that they had to pick from. Average UC GPA from Basis Scottsdale was right in line with Torrey Pines at that 4.26. So regardless of what high school you're coming from, you still need to have a really, really high, really, really strong GPA. Now, the reason why I wanted us to look at 3 different high schools is I want to point out the UCs directly compare students to their peers. They look at all of the applicants coming from that specific high school, and your student will be judged based on the opportunities available to them at that high school and how well the other students perform at that high school in their graduating class. Oftentimes, I hear it time and time again where my students say, I'm going to do these things because everyone I know does these same things. It's really important, especially when it comes to the UCs, that students discover ways to distinguish themselves. In a sea of 250 applicants from one high school, it can be incredibly difficult to make yourself stand out. Now, one of the reasons why a lot of people pick on the UCs is I hear this time and time again. The UCs don't like California kids. They prefer kids from out of state or from international schools. While I would love to jump on this train because I do like to pick on the UCs, that's actually false. If we look at the numbers for the incoming freshman classes at all of the UC campuses, the overwhelming majority are California residents and California students. The problem is that California is a massive state, hugely populated and hugely popular, and the California school systems, such as the UCs, are utterly inundated with applicants. They get far more applicants from California high schools than they do for out of state and international. So while the acceptance rate at out of state schools may be higher, they're still taking less students from other states. The problem is that the competition coming from California is incredibly fierce. Most students who attend California high schools will apply to most, if not all, of the UCs. This is even despite the fact that the UCs might not be a good fit for them. Later on in the webinar, we're going to look at some example college lists from my students this year. And one of my students really enjoyed the idea of being able to explore different fields. They liked small class sizes, getting to know their professors, and yet they still applied to multiple of the UC campuses, despite the fact that the UCs don't meet that criteria. When questioned, my student, like so many other of my students in the past, have said, well, I'm applying just in case to the UCs. But the fact of the matter is, for the vast majority of UC campuses and for the vast majority of students, the UCs are not just in case schools. They are incredibly competitive and incredibly difficult to gain admission to. I'll pick on one more of the UCs. I won't just pick on UCLA, don't worry. I'll pick on my alma mater, UCSD. Here we see very similar trends. So again, if we look at those same 3 high schools, from Torrey Pines High School, we had just under a 17% acceptance rate. They accepted 40 students, but had almost as many applicants as UCLA did, 236. Slightly lower average UC GPA for students who were admitted at 4.24, but that is still an incredibly high GPA. Cathedral, significantly higher acceptance rate, 26.5%, but again, really due to the fact that there are fewer applicants coming from that high school. Slightly higher average GPA to be admitted as well. And if we go outside to Arizona, back to basis, we see an acceptance rate of nearly 60% into UCSD, simply because UCSD had so few applicants from that high school, but they still accepted 15, the least out of any of these 3 schools, but an overwhelming amount of the students from that high school who applied. And we see a slightly lower GPA being accepted into UCSD that year. So again, I just want to emphasize, Students, especially at the UCs, are directly compared to the other students who attend their high school. The UCs, as I mentioned, utterly inundated with applicants. And in that sea of 250 students applying from one high school, students will look very similar oftentimes. They take very similar classes. If they're applying to UCLA as a strong candidate, they have very similar grades, which is essentially straight A's. It's all about standing out in good ways. When we evaluate the 13 factors that the UC system uses for their cumulative review when looking at applicants, the first several factors are always the same for all of the UC campuses. It's how rigorous were their classes, how great were their grades. Those are not places where students can significantly distinguish themselves. But if we continue looking down that list, we start to see areas where students can make themselves stand out in good ways. The UCs look at if your student is significantly talented in an art or a music or something performance-based. They look at their exceptional ability to be leaders. They look at their community involvement and how passionate they were about helping others. They look for measurable achievements, not just with test scores like the AP scores, but with awards, particularly in areas where students have demonstrated a passion. And they look oftentimes for that academic spike. At a certain point in high school, did a student discover their academic passion? And did they lean into that passion with their extracurriculars, with their summer activities? Again, when it comes to the UCs, it's about making yourself stand out in significant ways for the best. And there are certain things that you won't be able to change, but there are lots of things that you can control when it comes to the UCs. Now, I'll leave the UCs alone, at least for a little bit, and I'll pick on some other schools. When we look across the country, the trends that we see nationwide are that the overall number of applicants are on the rise, which means the overall acceptance rates are on the decline. Year after year, universities report record high number of applicants and a record low acceptance rate. We briefly touched on this in webinar 1, but there's a few reasons for this. One is that the expectation leaving high school for most students now is that they will immediately attend a four-year university. If we look back at 10, 15, 20 to 30-year trends, that has really increased. In previous cycles, that wasn't the expectation. A lot of students would have gone into a trade school or a junior college route. That expectation seems to really be diminishing. Another reason why we see this overall number of applicants on the rise is that there are a lot of programs now specifically designed to help specific groups of students attain a four-year college education, whereas before it might have been out of reach. There's programs that help first-generation college students, Indigenous students, colleges from rural areas, students who might be coming from lower socioeconomic statuses. All of these programs are just leading to more and more students applying directly into four-year colleges. And then lastly, one of the biggest factors we saw was with the COVID landscape and test optional policies. For a lot of students who had strong GPAs, but maybe weren't strong test takers, when test optional policies came around, there was suddenly no longer a burden to apply. It felt much more accessible for a lot of students. And so a lot of those students started applying more and more than ever before. And while Erin mentioned test optional is oftentimes not optional for a lot of students at a lot of universities, that doesn't stop students from applying more and more. Lastly, students tend to apply to more universities than they did before. Pre-COVID, most students would apply to maybe 13 to 17 universities. Now, a lot of my students apply to 20, 25, even 30 if they're applying to really impacted majors. So that is also contributing to this trend. Now, colleges are trying to offset some of this. We're noticing that a lot more schools are starting to implement binding early decision programs in an effort to try to diminish the overall number of applicants that they receive. However, for at least the next few years, we do not in any way anticipate that these trends are going to diminish. We actually expect they're just going to continue increasing. So year after year, more students will keep applying, and those colleges will turn down more and more students. If we look outside of the University of Michigan and Northeastern, both of which have said this year will be their lowest acceptance rates, let's look at some other top tier universities. So we'll call out Harvard, MIT, Princeton, Stanford, and Yale, some of the big five in terms of most prestigious, most well-known universities. If we look at these trends, we see the exact same thing that we were looking at with Michigan and the UCs. We see that those overall acceptance rates are just diminishing. Now in 2020, we did see a little spike. And the reason, of course, was because of the pandemic. Many students felt uncertain about paying private school tuition to attend an online college, essentially, or they no longer wanted to leave home. Their priorities shifted. So we did see a little increase in the number of acceptances at a lot of universities during that year, because a lot of those colleges would turn to their wait lists. They would accept students maybe that they wouldn't have in previous years simply because they really wanted the security of that tuition. But since then, we have just seen again that downward trend. If we look at two specific schools, NYU and USC, both of which are on that top 10 most applied to colleges in the United States, in only 5 years, the overall number of applicants to NYU rose by nearly 40%. Their acceptance rate has dropped pretty much in half since that, in those 5 years. At USC, if we look at a 10-year trend, overall number of applicants rose by almost 70%. That's an astronomical rise in the number of applicants. Their acceptance rate dropped 10%. This year, they haven't put out their data yet, but it's anticipated that it's going to drop close to 3% more than it was the previous year. We see this time and time again. Overall number of applicants is on the rise. Overall acceptance rates are on the decline. Schools are also utilizing their wait lists more and more. You may have heard this term from family friends or seen it on the internet, but the wait list warriors. We see top-notch students with great academic profiles getting waitlisted at 8, 9, 10 of the universities on their list because colleges are really utilizing those wait lists a lot more because they're getting so many qualified applicants that they're not prepared to say no to. Now, let's talk about what we do about this. Realistically, what do we do? There are things that your family cannot control. You can't change the fact that colleges are going to keep receiving more and more applications every year. Colleges are also attempting to build the most diverse class each admission cycle. Sometimes that diversity has to do with geographic location. Sometimes that diversity has to do with majors or programs of interest that they're trying to highlight. You can't change the fact that colleges will be seeking out their own types of diversity every year. Admissions officers oftentimes have an idea of the type of students or the type of class that they're trying to build before they ever open your student's application. Certain majors such as engineering, computer science, business at really top-notch undergraduate business programs are more likely to be heavily impacted and to see lower acceptance rates. Federal funding cuts, which were in the news a lot about a year ago, but are actually still happening today, may limit the number of available spaces for incoming students at certain universities. Colleges will be more conservative if they're unsure of what federal funding they'll be receiving for the year. More competitive high schools from more competitive regions, such as Southern California, can make admissions more difficult at certain universities, particularly those UCs where we see such a massive amount of a graduating class all applying from one high school. Now, none of that is in our control, but there are actually a lot of things you and your family and your student can control in this process. First and foremost, students can build a balanced college list. There should absolutely be some schools on that list that are crazy hard to get into. Your student is unlikely to be admitted because everyone is unlikely to be admitted. But that list should also be anchored in universities that do have somewhat higher acceptance rates, or universities where your student does supersede the averages that that college puts out, where your student is not just a strong, but a super strong candidate at that college. Your student can be strategic about where they apply and how they apply. Does it make sense to utilize a binding early decision or a restrictive early action? Those are all strategic decisions that I talk about with my students and families all the time, because a lot of applying to college nowadays is not just about being a great student, it's about having a strategy in place. Students can do their research so that they really know why those colleges are a good fit. It's things that they can highlight in their supplements and in their essays so that they can demonstrate to that college they're going to positively contribute and that they're a candidate that that college wants based on what they're looking for. For universities that track demonstrated interest, it is going to sound crazy, but there are colleges that literally track whether or not you open their emails and how long you spend on their emails and if you click around on their emails. For universities that track that, if it's a college that's on your students list, they need to engage back with that university. They need to show that they care. Students can be strong in the data that they submit to colleges, grades, test scores, extracurriculars, all of that is within your power. Not entirely, given that we only have a few weeks left until APs, but studying and doing your best is absolutely still in your control. Students and families can be organized when it comes to the college application process. You do not get do-overs for your college applications. If you miss a deadline, you don't apply to that university. This is why I tell all of my students we start early and we are super organized. It can be an organizational nightmare applying to college if you're not prepared to really micromanage the entire process. And lastly, we're going to dig into this a lot in webinar 3, but students can be absolutely exceptional in the narrative that they provide to colleges, their essays, their activity lists, their applications. Yes, admissions officers will see every class and every letter grade your student receives. But when it comes to extracurriculars and to essays, that admissions officer really only knows what you tell them. So make sure you're telling them exactly what it is you need to tell them to be that attractive candidate for that college. I said that one of the first things you can control is building a balanced college list. So let's talk about how we start building that list. So for families who are local to San Diego, I recommend going to visit a couple local schools. Maybe check out San Diego State and UCSD. Your student can see two large public universities that have very different feels. San Diego State, there's a bigger emphasis on the social atmosphere, on sports, on school spirit. It's a much smaller campus, even though there's a large student body, versus UCSD. When you go do a tour there, there's a big emphasis on academics, on making the most of the opportunities, on research. It's also a very spread out campus, which some students may or may not like. Then you can pivot and go check out a school like University of San Diego or Point Loma Nazarene to see a smaller or more medium-sized private school. Take a tour and see what they have to offer to see if that's a good fit for your student. Anytime you or your students go visit a college, I recommend making a pro-con list. And I tell my students, get into the nitty-gritty. I want you to be ridiculous with this. If you hated the lunch you had, write that down, because all of these different factors may end up being important when you think about living there for the next 4 years. From that pro-con list, a lot of students can come up with a list of absolute must-haves and absolute no-goes. These are non-negotiables when it comes to building their college list. This might be size, it might be location, it might be activities on campus. Do they want Greek life or not? It could be majors if they've already figured out what they want to study. Now, for students who are just starting to get into that or haven't really thought about it yet, if you have some colleges that you're interested in or that you think may be a good fit for you for various reasons, I recommend looking at all of the undergraduate majors at those universities. Jot down anything that sounds even remotely interesting. Then look at the course catalog for class descriptions. See if you'd actually enjoy taking some of those classes. And then start doing your research. And if you have a major in this particular field, what type of job would you get? Would that job be fulfilling? Does it change every day? Is it dynamic? Or do you want something that's more predictable where you know exactly what you're walking into every day? Do you care about earning potential and growth? Do you also care about helping your community or not? Those are all things to think about very broadly when thinking about what you're going to study that will lead to an eventual career. Now, when we first start really working on that college list building, as students begin to get a little older and start to figure out more of what they like, That first factor should still be that diversification, the balance. Yes, have the crazy hard to get into schools on the list, but anchor it in some schools where you really know you're going to be a strong, above average candidate. Location is often a huge factor for my students. Sometimes when they haven't even been to a state, I have a student will say, I would never consider that state under any circumstances. They might not necessarily know why, but they have a strong feeling about it one way or another. Location is huge typically for students. Size is also a really big factor and can help eliminate 1,000+ universities off the list immediately. Do you want to get lost in a crowd, or do you need more support? Do you want to know everyone on campus? Like I said, if students have a specific interest or a major that they want, they can use a lot of that to build their college list. Or on the flip side, if students are really unsure and they want the opportunity to explore instead of commit, find colleges that encourage that exploration. A lot of liberal arts schools really want students to be educated instead of trained. That might be important for your student. Extracurriculars, clubs, Greek life, sports, do they need a strong sense of community? Do they care about religion? Are they into performing arts and want to keep doing that as they get older? Or do they really care about internships and on-the-job training? Do they want to do volunteering? Things that fulfilled your student in high school arguably will continue to fulfill them in college. So it might be important that the things they feel passionately about now are things that are offered at their future college campus. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen, we have some resources to help start the college list building process. These are 5 different websites. They all have different criterias. You can put in certain factors and things that you care about. I think these can be really good. Please don't pay attention to the acceptance rates that they might list. Those are wildly inaccurate. But I think it can be good just to get kids exposed to different colleges. Erin and I say this a lot. We've said it in webinar 1. I'll bring it back up now. Most students have only heard of 20 or 30 colleges in the entire country, and yet there's over 3,000. So most of our students have heard of about 1% of the universities in the US. So I think a lot of these online platforms can be good for just introducing students to different schools that they maybe haven't heard of or wouldn't have considered otherwise. Exposure is really great when it comes to building that college list, and it can often help with applying to colleges that aren't as inundated with that total number of applicants. Now, we're going to look at a few of my students from this year's actual college lists, and we'll talk about the criteria that we used when building this list, and we'll talk about their sort of academic factors that were important. So first student that we're looking at, perfect unweighted GPA, never had anything lower than an A, 1510 SAT, incredibly strong, really interested in pre-med. This student knew exactly what they wanted to do from a very young age. They had a great story as to why they were interested in it. Their path was set. They attended public high school. When it came time to build this list, the student really cared that their undergraduate university had access either to a medical school or to a hospital, because again, they knew what their path was and they really wanted to do shadowing and internships and research as an undergraduate to strengthen their application to med school. This student also really liked the idea of being in either a large university where it felt like its own city, or having access to a city was also important to this student. The only exception to that rule was Montana State and University of Montana, where the student could apply without paying tuition at all on a full ride. Ultimately, the student ended up applying to 23 colleges. To apply to those 23 colleges, this student wrote over 60 essays between applications, scholarship applications, and applications to honors colleges. When I tell my students and families applying to college is like a full-time job, I mean, applying to college is like a full-time job. For any of you who are my generation or older, this is wild. We wrote a handful of essays max. The workload and the expectation for students has become astronomical when it comes time to applying to college. Now, this student had some great results this year. Columbia University in New York will be lucky to have them next year in the fall. Now, if we look at another student, this student had a very different interest. They were interested in business, specifically in marketing. They also attend a public school, slightly lower SAT score, 1480, which is still an incredibly high score, 96th percentile, sometimes 97th, I think, still. Slightly lower unweighted GPA at 3.9. The student had a couple Bs in all of high school, nothing crazy. Criteria for building this list, they wanted to have access to an undergraduate business school, or they wanted to have access to a graduate business school on the same campus where they could take classes and still get that business experience. They also liked the idea of being in or very close to a major city. They liked that both for the social atmosphere, but also just for their peace of mind with flights and being able to get direct flights. This student ended up applying to 26 colleges and only had to write 48 essays to apply to those colleges and scholarships and honors colleges. And next fall, USC up in Los Angeles will be lucky enough to have this student. Now, the last student that we'll look at is the one that I referenced earlier in the webinar. This student really was undecided about their academic future. They liked economics and business, but also political science and pre-law. They took a psychology course that they found really fascinating, so really wanted access to a lot of exploratory programs, which did lean them much more towards smaller liberal arts colleges. This student also attends a private school and really loved the idea of getting to know their professors, of having smaller class sizes and that support, because that's something they got really used to in high school. This student had an overall ACT score of a 32, slightly lower unweighted GPA, 3.79, so a handful of Bs. Again, that's still an incredibly high GPA and test score in my opinion. This student, when we built out this college list, again, we were mostly looking at liberal arts schools or schools that would encourage the exploration. Having help from professors and support and a really strong sense of community was important. But like I mentioned earlier, this student still applied to 5 of the UCs, despite the fact that those colleges really don't meet most of those criteria. This student only had to write a little over 30 essays for applications, scholarships, and honors colleges. And what I will say, I'll put a little asterisk. While this student did write fewer overall essays, the prompts that we see oftentimes from a lot of the liberal arts colleges are really niche and super creative. So when it came time to the ideation and the brainstorming process, this student actually probably ended up spending just as much time as that first student who wrote double the amount of essays, because it really takes a lot of thought to encapsulate to a liberal arts college why you're undecided, why you're a good fit for exploration, why you care about being educated instead of trained. It can be really difficult to write those types of essays, especially for students who have grown up in a system that really pushes a lot more linear thinking and writing. Brainstorming for those types of prompts can be really time consuming. But next fall, this student is going to get exactly what they want from Davidson College. They're going to get a small liberal arts college. They're going to get to explore all different types of fields before they have to pick a major. They're going to have small class sizes and lots of support from their professors and from their peers. So ended up working out perfectly for this student. Now, I've potentially freaked some people out. Erin did mention I was going to dive into a lot of data. I love data. It's my favorite thing. Second favorite thing, I love helping students get into college first, but then second is data. So now that I've overwhelmed everyone slightly, Erin's going to break it down into what you need to be doing for at least the next few weeks.
None of you knew you were going to have homework tonight. So I'm here to give you your homework. First and foremost, we need to finish the academic year strong. That is our top priority right now. As we mentioned, grades are paramount. The letter grades that your students get in those classes are the most important factor in college admissions. So keep them focused on the finish line. We don't have that much longer left. Keep them focused and their heads in the game there. I'm going to jump around on this list a little bit. Secondly, they need to be focusing on their AP exams. Preparing for those exams is really important. If we can submit those scores, we want to submit those scores because it can legitimize the grades. It can make their application stronger. And in the case of Georgetown and Stanford, they want to see them. They're going to directly tell you that you need to send them. Besides that, for students who have not yet tested, who have not yet done the SAT or ACT, or who need to increase their scores a little bit on those exams, Right now is a great time as parents for you to get with us here at Hammer Prep. We're happy to offer your students a baseline exam for those exams so that we can see exactly where they are and we can help guide you through that process. If they are looking to increase their scores, we should have a conversation and talk about where they are, what their level of motivation is, and then we need to make a plan for tutoring, ideally starting as soon as the AP exams are over or very early in June, and moving forward through the summer for fall exams. For students who are a bit younger, start discussing colleges very generally, just like Andrea said. Open the door a crack. What are you looking for? What's important to you? Where do you see yourself? Very basic plan. Again, not right now. After the finals are over, you can start opening that door. And then with your sophomore and junior students, definitely start exploring colleges and building the list. Andrea will talk a little bit more about this later, and I'm sure through the Q&A, but we really want to have that college list built no later than the end of June. We really need to know where they're applying so we can start putting order to chaos with their applications and their essays. Last on your homework list, have your students use their summer wisely. This can depend wildly on how old they are. So if they're younger, freshmen, sophomores, really have them do some volunteering, get involved in their community, do something that they're excited about, passionate about. A lot of younger students don't have access to jobs. For older students, jobs are fantastic. A lot of our student athletes are very, very busy student athletes. Summer's a great time to do some extra classes, fit in some extra courses for credit, also too to fit in some volunteering or a job, something that they can put outside of their sport. We're going to shift towards the Q&A now. So as you have those questions that are percolating in your brain, please go ahead and pop them into the Q&A tab at the bottom. We really want to thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to get to as many questions as we possibly can. I'm going to do my best to categorize them into general topics. And we're going to get through as many as we possibly can. We would also love it if you would join us next month for our third in the series as we really dive into the application essays, how to start the writing process, how to get organized. And I will tell you, as she's mentioned a few times, getting started early is key. If you have very highly specific questions, want information on baseline testing, admissions work, need help with your child's academic classes, please reach out to me. We do it all here at Hammer Prep. We would love to work with your family. And so my information is on the slide of this last slide right here. Feel free to reach out and we'll help you out as much as we can. So getting into the questions. Hang on, let me look at these, what we've got here. Okay. We're going to dive into some counseling questions first. Andrea, this one says, how early should we start college tours? Is there anything that we should avoid?
So it somewhat depends. I'll say with a lot of my comprehensive students, I usually start to encourage the doing the college tours around like mid to late 10th grade, kind of sophomore year. I think the biggest things when it comes to those first college tours is to be very low pressure, very general, like Erin was kind of mentioning. Just think of it as super low pressure for your students. You don't want to tell a sophomore, go tour 10 schools and come back with a list. That is really overwhelming, especially because kids are going to change so much in those couple years of high school. So I think it's really important to go look at some schools, but keep it low pressure. If you're going to visit some family, hey, we're going to be in Boston. Let's go check out one of the schools. Like, take your pick, whichever one has the prettiest colors. Let's go look at it. Like, keep it very low key. For a lot of our students that we work with for the mini, they're older, they're at that end of junior year. They'll usually have somewhat of a list by the end of junior year. They might still be doing some college tours, and summer can be a good time to kind of finalize that list potentially, because a lot of times it still needs some more balance to it, some more diversification. But younger students can also do it. I don't recommend anything earlier than like ninth grade, though, because kids are way too young at that point. They're not thinking about college yet. They don't want or need to think about college yet. But I would say like mid to late 10th grade is kind of a good time to really start just generally exploring.
This is in a similar sort of track. This says, how early will you start with a student for counseling?
I think Erin and I have officially cut it as you have to be second semester of eighth grade because
We will still talk to you before then, but we will start
yes,
counseling before second semester.
wildly enough, we always get people wanting to start earlier than that. I mean, we start honestly as soon as high school starts. We help with, picking classes. With my younger students, it's much different conversations. It's about exploring things they might be interested in. It's about encouraging them to just find organic ways to get involved. I want kids to do things that they care about, that they enjoy. And while in the back of my head, of course, I'm building a narrative, I'm thinking of what the implications are for the college application process. I don't want my young students to be thinking of it like that. I want them to think of, I like this class, I like this club. But we start with kids, when they're fairly young. And for a lot of us, older people on this, that is wild. Because to think that when I was in ninth grade, some old lady like me would have been like, these are classes you should take. I can't even fathom that. But like we keep saying, the landscape changes so much that yeah, a lot of young students in ninth and 10th grade will really start working with us.
Our goal is to make this process easier on your family and on your, especially on your student. And so when we do start with students earlier, freshman year, sophomore year, we're able to shape that narrative and we're able to take some pressure off of them. When we get them late in high school, their story's already told. Their story's already kind of in concrete. And so then we can just polish it and make it pretty and choose to highlight different things. So that's why we like to start with students early. I think it's important for all of you to know that she's alluded to comprehensive and the mini comprehensive. We have a limited number of students. They work with her from whenever they get started all the way through graduation. And so we take a limited number of students. We are completely sold out for the current sophomore class, the class of 2028, but I do have spots for younger students, so freshmen and sophomore. This question is why why are there so many essays?
A couple reasons. So part of it is on the student. We'll put some blame there because, like I said, most students, and not just my students, this is national trends. Students apply to a lot more universities than they used to. And so that every time you add a college, oftentimes that adds work in some form or another, particularly when it comes to the writing and the essay process. So part of it is, we'll take burden for that. But the other part of it is the universities. I'm going to put blame on them as well. Year after year, they increase the amount of work that students need to do to apply. And I do think part of that is them trying to offset that crazy rise in the number of applications that they see. They do try to make it harder to apply, to put more and more work into it, potentially to discourage students from applying. But for example, 10 years ago, not even 10 years ago, 5, 6 years ago, Harvard had one supplemental essay and it was technically optional, which like probably not, but like, okay.
Not all.
And it was pretty open-ended. Like they gave a couple various prompts, but they were like, but just like tell us something about yourself that you think we'd want to know. This year they have 8 and they're not optional and they're no longer open-ended. It's like, tell us 3 things your roommate would like to know about you. Like, okay, calm down. Like, so part of it is students apply to more and more schools, but the bigger part is colleges are making it more and more work to apply to schools, particularly when we talk top 20, top 30, top 50. They are going to continue to increase the workload, again, potentially to try to discourage some applicants, but also just because they freaking can.
I mean, the other thing too, and we've talked about this, is that for a lot of these schools where the acceptance rate is so low, every candidate that they're getting is qualified. They all have amazing GPAs. They're in similar activities. They all are the president of this and the captain of that. And so the essays, by asking these kind of really weird and obscure, and Andrea will give you some examples in the next webinar of the really weird bonkers essays that come up. But they ask some of these really weird things to see, first of all, if the student will take the time to answer them. 100%. University of Chicago is famous for that. And then secondly, to get an idea for this kid's personality. Just on paper, they look perfect, but do they have anything valid to say? This is a great question. It says, if a student knows in advance that he or she does not want to take the SAT or ACT and submit scores, what do you suggest is a good initial process for building a list?
So if your student knows they're not going to take an SAT or ACT, so they know they're applying test optional, there's a couple things you need to consider. First off, obviously, any test required colleges are gone. So you need to immediately eliminate those, either with the help of someone like a counselor or through a lot of really diligent research. Then the next group you kind of need to cut out are the test recommended schools. So a lot of students, will give us this sort of rhetoric of like, well, it doesn't really matter. But if you dig into the data, and we kind of talked about this in webinar 1, there are universities where their rhetoric and their statistics are very clearly demonstrating they are not test optional, right? When you look at some of those top tier schools, I'll call out Princeton. Because why not? They are technically still test optional. You are not required to submit test scores to Princeton. But if I look from even a year ago, it's only going to get worse this year, but the previous year, 80% of the students they accepted submitted test scores, not just test scores, exceptional test scores. So would I call Princeton test optional? No, I would call them heavily test recommended, because if you apply without a test score there, you're immediately at a disadvantage. So you want to weed out those schools as well. You want to look for the schools that more kind of have that, 50% of our students accepted submitted test scores. That's really more of a balance and a sort of test optional. And then test blind is also a great place to start looking. Obviously, the UCs and the Cal State's massive system that are test blind, but there are also some other ones. University of Washington is really kind of test blind, University of Oregon. There's some other schools that you can kind of start looking at. But I will say, for most of my students who choose to apply test optional for whatever reason, they need to be prepared to apply to more colleges. Applying test optional typically makes results a little less predictable. So I do recommend that students, if you're not going to spend the time studying for the test and prepping for that, put that time into applying to some more schools just to make sure that list is really well-rounded and you're going to have some great options, because applying without a test score, it will make the results a little bit less predictable typically.
I would also say, I don't know that your student's particular situation, make sure that you've actually taken baseline exams for both tests. So you don't want the student to say, yeah, I'm just going to go test optional because that's, I don't want to take the test, or I don't want to put the work in. We want to make sure that we can't get a score that would make you more competitive and make these admission decisions be more of a sure thing. There's no sure thing in admissions, but like make it at least a little bit more predictable. And so whether it's with us or with somebody else, at least take the time to get the baselines. Just take the time to get the baselines and have somebody look at them, because there are students, I'll be very honest, there are students when I look at their baselines, I do advise them to go test optional, just because their grades are great and their scores are probably not going to get them to the level where they want to be. So take the time to do the baselines. There's a question about counselors. It says, how much help will we realistically get from the school? They say that they'll help. And so, and not to hire someone is the end of that question. So not to hire somebody. How much help are we realistically going to get from them? Do you want to answer that? Or do you want me to answer it?
I think we'll probably both have strong feelings on this. Erin and I, we talk about this all the time. Counselors at high school would love to do this full time, but they can't, because they have to triage things. They're dealing with mental health crises. They're dealing with kids who are in classes that they shouldn't be in, right? There's so many things that counselors at the high school level have to do that I feel very blessed I don't have to deal with. And they would love to do this, but they just do not have the capacity to micromanage this process. So most counselors at the high school level, if you're at a private school that's smaller, your counselor will most likely recommend some schools. Typically, those schools are universities that the high school has a pretty good relationship with, and that's usually why they're recommending them. They're like, we send a lot of kids here. We've got a good vibe with this college. They'll sometimes look over like a finished, polished version of a personal statement and give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, but they are not helping with the brainstorming process or reading example essays and really walking a student through. They're not making outlines. When it comes to supplements, I don't think we've really ever had counselors at the high school level ever ask to even see supplements. I think they're usually just like, are those done? Cool, because you have a deadline. It can be an overwhelming amount of work and a huge process. The essays are so difficult because they're just so unlike anything students have done. And so I think counselors at the high school level, they would love to get to dig in deep to all of this stuff with your students, but they just have too many students to do it and they just don't have the time. They're also typically gone for the summer, as they should be. They work hard all year round. And so that's when we actually recommend most of our students get a lot of big pieces of writing done before senior year starts. And they most likely won't even have access to their high school counselor during that time.
Yeah, so I just want to chime in. So we used to give this statistic, I think, in previous webinars in webinar one, but high school counselors, the recommended ratio of students to high school counselors, it is now and has been since like 1970 something, 250 to 1. In the state of California, the last time that the survey was done, California is 464 to 1 on average. So just shy of double the number of students per counselor. The state that actually has the worst student to high school counselor or counselor ratio is actually the state of Arizona, and they're at 688 or something like that. They were over 700. It's better than it was. So when Andrea says that they really want to help, they really do. They 100%, this work is fun for them. They get into counseling to help kids get into college and to spark interest. So I would just say somebody is going to help your child. Somebody is going to need to help your child, whether that is you, whether it's an aunt or an uncle or a cousin or a friend who's gone through it before, a professional who does this full time. Your students are going to need somebody to help them get organized and stay on track. It is very, very rare to have a student who is motivated and has the skill set to put out quality work and do this volume of essays. There's a great question here. I'm gonna have to edit it slightly so that the person's anonymity is protected. But it says, could you please explain why the basis school has a much higher acceptance rate? Is it because of the school? Do they have a higher standard? Is there an equivalent of basis in the San Diego area? And then this person goes on to say, basically, should they move to Arizona in order to go to a school like Basis in order to guarantee admissions into some of these schools?
Okay, so many moving parts to this question.
Yes,
I will say the basis school system, there are basis schools in various cities in Arizona, and we've actually worked with a lot of students at
great.
them. I will say it is a great school system, really like top-notch academics. The students there take pretty rigorous courses, like right from the get-go. Ninth grade, most of my students who are coming out of basis are in APs and things like that, which is not as common out here. Do I think you should relocate your family to Arizona? No. Um, the reason why that acceptance rate, if we go back and look at those numbers, the reason why that acceptance rate is so astronomically high is because there are so few students from that high school applying. So it's not that the kids at basis are necessarily better than any of the kids in California. It's that the competition is so much lower. It's easier to stand out when there's 20 of you applying versus when there's 250 of you applying. But if you think of it that way, if you're coming from out of state, applying into UCs, for example, which is where we know they do this comparison to your peers at your high school, you're paying out of state tuition, which at that point is pretty much the equivalent of a private school. So why a lot of kids apply from California to the UCs and the Cal States is because financially they can be a really good fit. Once you're out of state, that financial security just flies out the window. And then you're in a position where you can just potentially be sending your kid to a private school for that amount of money, and they might get some better benefits from that anyway. But yeah, it's not that basis is better than Torrey Pines or Cathedral or anything like that. It's just that kids in Arizona don't care as much about trying to come to California. They're not applying by the hundreds to come to UCLA or UCSD like kids from California are. And all that means is that kids who are in California typically need to widen their list a little bit. That's really what that means. But no, I don't think it's worth moving to Arizona.
I think too, if you want to think like an admissions officer, so if you're somebody who's reviewing applications for the UC system, and you're looking at a new application about every 4 minutes, which is about the average for the UC system. If you're looking at that, then if you get an application from a kid who's from a school that you don't see very often, they're an exceptional student with an exceptional transcript, and you know that that student's going to provide a different voice to your campus. So that's another factor is a lot of times schools will look, and this works in our favor in other states as well. So for some of our kids who are applying to schools in other states where they don't get as many kids from San Diego, they're like, wow, this kid from San Diego wants to come and wants to live in North Carolina. And what they're a different voice. They're going to give us a different perspective than what we have from maybe some of our students. So that's the other factor. This is a great question too. Understanding that the UC GPA is paramount for UCs. Have you seen applicants getting into mid to top UCs, for example, UCSD, with a UC GPA of around a 4? How do they compensate for GPA with extracurriculars and other activities to make their holistic application attractive?
So I'll be blunt. You cannot make up for a not good GPA. And I hate to call a 4.0 GPA not good because that feels utterly ridiculous. But for students who are significantly below the average GPA for like those UCs coming from their high school, you really can't compensate. Extracurriculars will usually bridge a pretty small gap. The only times I've really ever seen a student with like a significantly below average GPA be admitted is if those quote unquote bad grades were all in one very specific time period and there was a very, very good explanation for why that happened. And even then, you've got to just hope and pray to whatever God you do or do not believe in that the right person picks up that application. Because again, those factors for admission that they're evaluating all students on, the top 5 of them are all to do with academic GPA, rigor, grades and classes. How do they compare to their peers? Are they in the top 9% of their graduating class? Those are all the top factors. Without those factors being in place, you're immediately losing a lot of the attention of that admissions officer because they're going to think potentially that your student, that they're taking a gamble on them. So you've got to have a backup plan. For a lot of California kids, we don't talk about this enough, but a great backup plan can really be our junior college. Our community college system is incredible in California. And when you look at transfer rates to top UCs from community colleges in California, huge differences, way higher acceptance rate because they get less applicants, but also students have more time to really solidify their grades, to do better at that community college system, to really see that academic spike, to maybe spend some more time on things outside of class that might make a big difference. But transfer rates to a lot of the top UCs are really strong coming from community colleges in California. I encourage you reach out to us. I can't give like a crazy amount of specifics for your specific student, but if they maybe qualify as like there was some sort of extenuating circumstance, there might be something else going on, then it might be worth like, okay, we still can't count on it, but like it may increase some chances. But yeah, for the UCs, grades are just absolutely utmost, really.
Because there's no other data, because the only other data they have is their AP scores. I do want to be really careful though with parents when you're listening to this, because there's a lot of you still on here. When we're talking about significantly below the UC GPA, we're not talking about the average at Torrey Pines was a 4.26 and then your student has a 4.19. That's not what we're talking about here. Like we're talking about a student who is like a combination A B student. So like if they've got like a 3.6 or a 3.7, that doesn't mean that they can't get into some of these schools, but like Andrew said, it's there's a difference between just slightly below that average and significantly below that average. We're going to jump a little bit to SAT and ACT. This parent says, can we pick either the SAT or ACT, or do we need to do both? And I will take this question because this is what I talk about all day long. So no, you don't need to do both. I do recommend that you try both because we want to make decisions based on data. We don't want to go with a gut feeling or my best friend took the SAT and she liked it better. We want to use data to drive these decisions because these exams are far different than they have ever been. One test is digital, one test is on paper. One test is longer, one test is shorter. One questions are slightly easier, one has a higher reading level. And so the only way to truly know is to take both exams. So we do that here. We do both exams and then we choose. And it's actually a very small percent. I don't know the exact number, but a very, very small percent of our students will actually take both official exams. It's got to be under 10% at this point. So students will pick, and that's because unlike when you and I applied to school, schools don't care which test you submit. And that's because both of these tests are scored on bell curves. These companies can show that no matter who takes the test, they're still getting their bell curves with their real results. And so since 2005, universities have accepted both exams equally. So there is no advantage, even though a lot of our parents have a preference for the SAT because that's what they were forced to take living in California. The schools truly don't care. So do your homework, do the baseline test, see which test is better, and then have somebody like me or another professional in like my position tell you which test is better. Okay. Um, this question asks, do UCs look at AP scores?
Yes. Yes, they do. So UCs will ask on the application for you to report APs. They do allow you to do what's called score choice, where you select which scores you want them to see, which ones you report. They will give credit for most AP exams. So yes, UCs ask for AP scores. They use them in admissions. They also use them for placement and or giving your student credit if they decide to attend a UC.
I will also chime in here that the UCs did not really choose to go test blind, despite what their PR department is trying to tell people. They got sued, and they got sued during COVID. They lost their lawsuit, and basically the lawsuit said that they shouldn't be allowed to be test optional in the COVID landscape. And so what ended up happening is they settled with this group that sued them and they said, fine, we won't take SAT or ACT scores. We will be test blind through the class of 2025. The people who sued them were not smart enough and did not understand admissions enough to understand that this AP piece existed and that they should also include that in their lawsuit. And so as soon as everything was kind of like finalized with the lawsuit, all of a sudden the admissions officers from the UCs were going, hey, send us your AP scores. All those tests that you take, send them to us. And so they were flat out in webinars saying, if you have AP scores and if they're competitive, send them. So that they had that data that would again help them pull students and so they can see how strong of a student that student really is. This question actually goes directly in line with this, and it says, our private high school does not offer AP classes. They are called advanced studies classes now. Do you recommend students still go out and study on their own to take these AP tests? And we both are probably going to answer this question, but go ahead, Andrew, you go first.
So, I mean, students are evaluated in the context of their high school. So, an admissions officer is going to say, okay, at this school, I'm pretty sure since you called them advanced studies, I know what school you're talking about. But okay, this student didn't have access to AP classes, AP curriculum. So, it's not expected that your student takes AP classes then. However, if you go to a competitive high school that doesn't offer APs, that offers something like honors or advanced studies instead, you will notice a large percentage of students in your kid's class will be signing up for AP exams and taking AP exams. And so again, when your student is being compared to their peers at their high school, they're not expected to have taken AP classes because those aren't available in the curriculum. But if an overwhelming amount of students from your kid's grade level are taking AP exams that somewhat correlate with the advanced studies class that they're in, your student may look not as competitive comparatively. Unfortunately, because I think that's dumb, but
I think the cool thing about the schools, and there's multiple schools that have gone away from APs, the cool thing about it is that it's allowed the teachers to really get into depths that they couldn't do with the AP curriculum because they were forced to teach a standardized curriculum. They were forced to go in a certain order. Everything was the same. The expectations were the same. The way they taught the questions was the same. So it allows these teachers to have more creativity, which is really super cool. I will tell you that our students who go to schools, and there are a few of them that we work with that go to schools that do not offer APs and offer these kinds of classes, they tend to do very well on the AP exams, but they need to start preparing sooner because the teachers are not going to teach them or usually, they're not going to teach them the test taking techniques that they need for those exams. So we see it a lot in the history curriculum. So you'll have students who know all of the content and they're phenomenal historians. They have really like deep thoughts and they're able to make deep connections, but they don't know how to write a good DBQ because they haven't had the practice with it. And so, with those students who are going to take the APs, I recommend that they start much sooner in preparation for the exam. They need to learn how to do the different components of that test, and they need to make sure that their teacher did not skip over one or two of the units that were in that class that's going to show up on the exam. We did have a teacher 3 or 4 years ago who decided that he wanted to teach part of his master's thesis to his physics students. And those students spent like 6, 8 weeks in the weeds with this guy's master's project. They were missing huge gaps of knowledge that they had to go back and relearn, and we had to teach them. So just be careful with that. But yeah, start earlier if you can take them. That's great. That we're going back to high schools. So Andrea, is it better to attend a high school that is in the lower or middle of the road and be top of your class, or is it better to attend a top 10 high school in the county and be an average or typical student there?
There's not a right or wrong answer to this. I do think that, more competitive high schools do tend to offer a lot more opportunities to students that they can take advantage of, which I do think is a big benefit. But I will say, depending on your students' college goals, it is oftentimes better to be a big fish in a small pond. If your student is really targeting top tier schools, UCs, and things like that, there could easily be an argument made that if they go to a lower academic school, but they really stand out and they're one of the top students at that school, that they may realistically have much stronger sort of admissions results. But again, that really does depend on the schools that your student's interested in and where they want to apply.
If you're a parent of a middle schooler who's trying to make this decision right now, like I don't ever recommend that parents try and game the system. That is not smart. You have to know who your student realistically is, how hard they're willing to work. Are they going to put the work into their academics? But if you are trying to make the decision between going public or private, or if you're trying to decide between 2 or 3 different high schools, I'm happy to have that conversation with you. But I would tell you that you need to look very carefully at the course catalog of that high school. A lot of schools that are considered to be not great high schools actually offer an absolutely crazy amount of dual enrollment classes, where the students have access to college courses and they are able to take an unbelievable amount of them. And that is hugely helpful. It also directly demonstrates to the university that you can handle college classes. And those students oftentimes will go into college already as sophomores. And so you want to look at all of the factors with each school and be really realistic. A lot of our families have one kid who attends one school and another kid who attends another because they know that junior can handle a school that's on a 4x4 schedule, whereas their older child maybe needed a more traditional track. And so I'm happy to talk to parents about that if they have questions. I have 2 people asking about the recordings. Yes, we're happy to send out the recording. It's going to take us a few days, so we will send them out to everybody who was registered for this. It's going to take us a couple of days to get them out, so please be patient with us, but we will get them uploaded and we will send you the link. And then there's just a couple of questions, Andrea, about just a couple of questions about just sort of like acceptance rates, if you don't mind. We've got a couple minutes left. So there's a question about the UC stats. It says, oh, actually, we already answered that one. Never mind. And then, okay, with the admissions rates dropping so much, how many schools do you recommend applying to if the student is considering a competitive major such as engineering? You mentioned engineering and computer science, but if they're looking at a competitive major, how many schools?
There's not a set number because it really does depend on the type of schools that the student is applying to, but I'll be honest, a lot of my students who are applying as engineering majors apply to 25 to 30 colleges typically each year. And a big reason for that is it is a heavily impacted major, and so they want to make sure that they have options. But also sometimes students who are into engineering, they might have a slightly different profile in terms of what they're looking for. Like some students really like the idea of a tech school, and other students are like, I want access to that, but not a full tech school. So their college list might be large, but it also might be like really kind of wildly diverse in terms of the types of schools on that list. Because there are a lot of schools that have really strong engineering departments that are kind of like fly under the radar. You wouldn't necessarily assume that.
This question says, why do you recommend that juniors take tests in the fall? Don't they need more school? Do you want me to take that one?
I'll let you take it, but I will say because junior year sucks. Because every single one of my students, hands down, will say junior year made them just want to throw themselves off a proverbial cliff. But I'll let Erin answer the do they need more school?
I will pile onto that and tell you that most years we do have at least one junior that we call their parents when they're at tutoring, and we tell the parent that they're too tired to drive and that they need to come get them. So, the Andrea's right that that is part of it. The part of it is that we recommend that they prep over the summer before their junior year so that we can take something off their plate second semester. Second semester junior year is absolutely brutal. But the other thing is the information and the advice of taking one test at the end of their junior year and one test at the beginning of their senior year is actually very antiquated. So when we all, and I'm including myself with all of you parents, when we all applied to schools, we usually, the traditional track for math had us getting to Algebra 2 as juniors. And so the advice was basically take the test end of your junior year so that you've had enough math. Most of our students are taking a faster track in math now. And so most of them have had all of the math that is going to show up or close to all of the math that's going to show up on these exams. As far as their reading ability goes, as sad as this statement is, their reading is not going to change much. Between a sophomore and a junior or a junior and a senior, it's not going to change much. Their reading level is fairly developed. Their reading comprehension skills is fairly developed. Some of you have students who have not willingly picked up a book since they were in elementary school. And so that's not going to change their score. It's not worth waiting and having to do this on top of college applications, on top of end of junior year, um, if you can start sooner. It's not to say that seniors shouldn't be doing this. They absolutely should if they don't have scores, but we like to take that off of people's plates if we can do it. Also, too, the SAT is offered 8 times a year, 8 times a school year. The ACT is offered 7 times a school year. So the earlier we start, the more ability we have to be flexible. So our students who are starting before their junior year, we're able to say if things get really tough, we're able to say, okay, we can pause. We can pause while you're in football season and we can pick back up again. If you're a senior and you're being recruited for football and you're in football season and you need scores, we have to continue to press through anyway. And so that's really the answer of why we push that timeline. And then this question says, how long does it take to get ready for the SAT? So I'm going to give a general answer on this because it's SAT and ACT. Unfortunately, the answer is it depends. It depends on what your goals are. It depends on where you're starting. With us, because we're one-on-one, we're very highly efficient. And so we do smaller amounts of tutoring per week, but we do it over a longer period of time. And that is because we are trying to change their habits. These exams, we talked about this in webinar 1, these exams are process-driven exams. And so it's not enough just to know content. And so changing their habits and changing the way that they approach material takes time. So in general, we spend about 12 weeks with our students if they're being diligent about their work. But it's going to depend on the starting score, and it's honestly going to depend on how much math we have to teach. We do have one more question. This is about a major, so I'm going to let you take this one. It says, how do you guide your students through picking a major? Do you have to choose and stick with it?
So that depends on the college that your student decides to go to. Some colleges will basically require like a blood oath of you pick this major, you're stuck with it. Cal Poly Slow. And other colleges really encourage more of that exploration, even within certain fields like Purdue, University of Michigan. If you go engineering at those colleges, everyone first year is general engineering. You have time to decide what type of engineering you want. When it comes to my students, it really depends on how far along they are in the process. Some students, like I said, we looked at student A. That student knew from a very young age they're going to be a cardiothoracic surgeon. They knew it. Everyone in their family knew it. It was well established. Most students, don't know that at the age of 6. And that's okay. And maybe a little less scary, honestly, because they could and should change over the years. So when I start talking about majors with my student, I really do more of like an interest inventory. We talk about classes they like, topics they've enjoyed learning about, how they choose to spend their time when they're not sitting in a classroom, things that they feel like they're good at, things that they maybe feel like they're not as good at. And I start to use that to really kind of drive that process. And then again, when we're looking at majors, we also need to be thinking about future careers. And so we do have that discussion of, is it important that you help people? Is it important that your job be dynamic and changing, or do you want something more static? And honestly, nowadays in this sort of changing landscape, we also talk about jobs that and majors that tend to be more insulated from being replaced by AI, because I do think that's something that a lot of students want and need to consider as they kind of continue to move through this process.
When I do my initial consults with families, especially younger students, I talk a lot about finding some schools that are of interest. They don't have to be schools that the student's actually going to apply to. But at a lot of the schools, if you Google undergraduate majors at Michigan, for example, it'll pull up a list of all of the majors that you can graduate with as an undergraduate student. And then if you click on those majors, it will give you a list of all of the classes that you have to take in order to graduate that major. Or it'll tell you notable alumni have graduated with this major, have done this with their lives. And so there are majors that are added every single year. Schools are constantly changing up their course catalog and what is offered. And so it is a great exercise to have your student look at some of those undergrad majors and see what's interesting to them. Because in school, we really only talk about 5 majors. The teachers and the faculty typically only goes into the biological sciences, engineering, computer science, business, and psychology. Those are the 5 most impacted majors across the country. And so if your student loves math and loves biology, but they know they don't want to be a doctor, and they know they don't want to go into any sort of healthcare, probably don't want to do active hands-on research, they may stumble upon computational biology and say, oh, wow, this combines my love of math and biology while still adhering to the principles that I want to live my life by. And so I do highly recommend picking 4 or 5 schools and just kind of doing that exercise. The students will also see different majors, and they'll think that something's cool, and then they realize, oh, I've got to take 6 years of higher level math. Nope, I'm out. I'm done. That's not for me. So I recommend sort of doing that path with earlier students too. We have been talking for a very, very long time. So I am going to cut us off there. And I really appreciate all of you joining us tonight. Thank you for your time at this busy time of year. Please, please, please join us on May 20th at 6 p.m. for application help. We are going to look at the applications, the essays, how to write a powerful essay. We're going to look at some of those crazy prompts that show up, and then also how to get your student organized. So if you do have questions, please reach out. Erin at hammerprep.com. Andrea's information's on there as well. Andrea at hammerprep.com. We appreciate your time and your attention. And thanks for joining us. Have a good night.